Several of my recent video works explore oil, ice, and water and how these relate to living forms as well as to narrative forms. On their own terms, these videos look for conceptual and aesthetic tools with which to engage our physically transforming planet. What interests me particularly with materials like oil, ice, and water is that they operate as a medium that records history, its own history, by storing and tracking the chemical and thermal alterations that the planet has undertaken. They are time-based media, like video, if you will. Temporalities play a vital role in global warming. Subatlantic, the short video I'm going to screen in a moment, engages time and temporality in multiple ways. It attends to the present ecological anxiety, pondering how humans and other species collectively attune to the idea of an unstable living environment where our very subsistence is uncertain. The video is as much about the physical and natural environment as it is about the psychic space we inhabit and of which we are a part, because the transformations occurring in the atmosphere affect not only the physical but also the mental climate on Earth. They force us to think ecologically and hence to consider other cosmopolitics, which is what this video proposes to do. So let me screen it in full. It's only 11 minutes. Low temperatures and westerly winds determine the climate on the island. The fog seeps into the mine's corridors, and the sea enters every fissure. She is in charge of measuring fluctuations and sending the data to the lab on the coast. She inventories the freezing and melting, minutely recording encounters with difference. All seems to follow a dynamic order: the winds, the streams, the birds, the sky. The faintness of change made it hard to detect, but the rocks witnessed the steady rise of the sea until one day all technical equipment had to be moved further inland. The coast sank into the ocean for 1,000 years. The lab now lies submerged at the bottom, 100 yards deep, together with other dwellings of the islanders. To do her science, she had to become a diver, measuring a sinking, contracting world. Only the oceans are expanding. She makes efforts to attune her eyes to see underwater and fuse with the swarming sea, where the tiniest of microbes operate on an interoceanic scale. Ocean currents gather in the Caribbean, swirling eastward and upward. Driven by warm winds across the Atlantic, they prevent ice from forming by the shores.
The warm streams plunge northern Europe into mild winters. The water masses take measure. In the Arctic Sea, the dense salty water drops to the deep ocean floor and then flows back to tropical regions. The process animates the global ocean streams. Circulation is dense in the submarine rivers and thick with nutrients. The massive influx of Arctic meltwater impedes the sink to the sea floor. The ocean streams are slowing down before they stop altogether. Will England's climate resemble Labrador's? There was questioning in the water. Now she examines the calcium pattern in snail shells lying at the sea bottom. Water chemistry tells its stories of ancient ice melts, forgotten and retold. In these withering realities, she is sampling the floor in the absence of many species. On board of Explorer 2, she joins the bioprospecting team in search for marine genetic resources. She brings in the directives for interspecies communication. The International Seabed Authority is keen to bring within the Oceanic Constitution any new genetic materials extracted from deep below, particularly these extreme methane-eating organisms. She practices a science of intensities. Out in the weather, she studies the self-organizing flows of matter and energy and the threshold at which sudden phase transitions occur in physical systems. For instance, from a solid to a liquid state. This process involves divers, videographers, and metaphysicians. Masses of microorganisms have been trapped in the polar ice sheets for longer than human time. Locked in frozen layers, a universe of ancient creatures awaits another chance at life. Some are 400,000 years old and still alive. Rumors say they have been involved in some lateral transgenetic activities and are now floating outside of history. From the dissolving ice cape, tons of microbes make their way back into the liquid environment, reshaping the chemistry of the oceans and the atmosphere. The meltwater bears new genetic material that the world hasn't seen. Released from the deep freeze, they begin to assemble genetic futures. Apprehension flushes into the cold water and blends with new matter, intensely communicating with fragile marine systems. Subatlantic is a visual sci-fi poetry about a female scientist on a North Atlantic island who is undertaking instrumental observations in the field around the time of the last glacial melts 12,000 years ago. She simultaneously inhabits multiple temporalities that span across millennia, slowly crafting a history that harbors a language still to be announced. Different representations of time run parallel and along each other. Spoken in the off from a submerged Atlantic position, the post-glacial, pre-modern narrative unfolds across the subatlantic. The term subatlantic is the proper nomination for the climatic phase we are currently in, which started 2,500 years ago and is quickly evolving towards another phase yet to be determined. The point I'm making here is that the post-human condition, where humanism is no longer the dominant premise, reconnects us to infinitely larger, untamable forces that animate extra-historical dimensions. This sudden burst of time bubble plunges us humans into deep time, that is, into geological and climatic timescales where we have to index ourselves anew. The video Subatlantic provides fuel for this process of imagining a reorientation of human-Earth relations. At first, the observations are directed to the physical environment that can be scientifically measured and recorded, the wind, the waterline. Later in the video, they move on to consider scientific practices of intensities and phase changes, which are relative to energy and dynamics rather than materials. More precisely, material and immaterial entities are deeply entangled, as in this narrative, thoughts materialize. They reconfigure to engage the changing ecology. They merge with frozen methane. They become part of weather events, unhinge new maritime cohabitations. These fusions acknowledge the ideational, that is, the world of thoughts and ideas, as an underlying aspect of the landscape. It's not the kind of relation scientists have to matter. These narrative elements in the video express a mild form of ecological anxiety. The topos here is not escape. Rather, it maintains a relation to a known reality, merely presenting a mutation of form and content. The observer and the physical reality together become other, mutating their ability to operate in and as a world. The intention with these scraps of irrational thoughts is to open synapses in the brain, and perhaps elsewhere, that allow for new ecological connections between our perception and the living environment. If we deeply want to get involved in the current planetary transformations, we need science as well as art. They both plunge themselves into the materiality of the universe, though with very different aims in mind. Subatlantic is constantly swaying between phenomenological narrative and scientific reason. Global warming, with its undisciplined disturbance, interpellates us to engage artistic and scientific paradigms in a conversation and let it infiltrate our imagination and practice. To think with and through art can unravel the role it might play in this process. We heard that masses of unknown microorganisms are released from the ice and begin to assemble genetic futures. To be post-human means to relocate in a new genetic milieu on Earth. The ocean streams are another vital planetary dynamic that is immediately affected by the melting ice, impacting hugely on the climate in the North Atlantic. All of these climate-relevant phenomena in the ocean are invisible, either because they take place underwater and out of sight, or too slow, or simply too immense to be perceived by the human eye. Art can play a role in making these processes perceptible in a way that scientific data cannot. Art can send imaginative narratives across the abstract registers of the scientific voice. How weather, ice, and microorganisms mediate the world is turned into something visible and audible, and hopefully comprehensible in a way that dramatically draws us into the interval between a terrestrial context and the immediacy of a localized becoming. Our female scientist engages in the transformation of the chemical and genetic composition of the oceans, not by technically intervening, but rather by reworking its tempi, resetting its landmarks, rerouting its premises, and not last, by attuning her own sensorial apparatus to survive under modified conditions. She is amphibian, variable, and diligent. When the economic dominates on nature and global warming, we have to devise differently powerful narratives and show the will for new explanations and new charismatic authorities. Dutch philosopher Rick Dolphin recently said, an artwork has to unfit the present and crack it open to give a glimpse of the earth to come. It should be a disturbance, create something unforeseen where our thinking falls short, so that another earth is invited to realize itself, unlike the one we know. Art is the form of creating unknown sensations, then, always temporary and provisional, never in the present. As Elizabeth Gross writes, tracings not of the past, but of the future, not of what we know already, but the unexperienced. 12,000 years ago, at the last glacial melt, the water line rose 100 meters and submerged many settlements along the shores of islands and continents, not just the Shetland Islands where I was filming. I thought it would be interesting to recreate this submerged speaking position, since we are now in a similar situation where many settlements along the ocean shores risk to be lost. The archaic sceneries bear no trace of human presence. The narrated figure exists only in the audio dimension. She is noticeable by her absence, emptied landscapes, staging time as a process of disappearance, where the cinematic event comes after a person has gone off stage. These images, however, disclose the plot of things. The way in which the world appears, and we are in its images. Humans in this account are not mere viewers of images, rather they dwell in them. Similarly, we all dwell in climate change. There is no outside to this phenomenon. Art cannot represent climate change as a whole. It's too vast, too complex, and exists in different temporality. But perhaps art can give some entry points. Art can play a role in conveying the immaterial and somewhat spectral nature of climate change, where important parts are not yet visible, audible, sensible. A science fictional approach can help draw people into the world in a way that matters to them. Just because something is real doesn't mean it cannot serve a fictional goal. The definition of fiction is not determined by whether something is true or false. It's the organization of elements that makes it fiction. The art is to create a form of articulation, of linking elements so that they belong to each other. That's how world building occurs. If a video sticks to the data, to facts only, it remains on the surface of reality. Yet reality is thick with meaning, intention, feeling, expectation, and narrative. This kind of reality is not already there, ready to be measured and represented. It's a reality understood as a selective relational process. From this perspective, the ocean is viewed as a site in which life materializes as a networked phenomena, linking the microscopic to the macrocosmic, bacteria to the biosphere, genes to globe. Suspicious of the corporate dynamic which drove globalization, ecology-related art has long focused on local ecosystems. Now artists are asked to attend to the planetary connectivity of ecosystems, grasping their place in relation to the larger scheme of forces. Like our fictional explorer of the Arctic icecapes, artists and curators are propelled into domains of knowing where for the most part they don't feel readily competent. Maritime genetics, carbon economics, atmospheric chemistry. Climate change urges art and art institutions to get involved in dynamics that are not comfortably located in the designated human-centric field of cultural inquiry, although altogether disturbingly and concrete and pertinent of human continuation. The efforts that we can observe for some time now aim at breaking down the opposition between science and poetry and instead offer a diverse configuration of that encounter. We will see where this takes us. What we can already say is that a common future that we share with everything else would be equally rooted in cultural and natural narratives. The collections of this common world, our heritage, would necessarily include at once cultural and natural histories. Perhaps from there, we can envision a less divided future that can harbor a post-human way of being in this world. Thank you.